Hello, and welcome to Change the Face of Yoga, teaching toddlers through golden oldies. I'm very excited to be talking to lots of yoga teachers who will explain their passion for teaching yoga to students with different ages, physical fitness levels, wellness levels, and different goals. They will explain the benefits of yoga for these students and will be including teacher tips and pose modifications. I am Stephanie Cunningham of Yoga Lightness, and I've been teaching over 50s for 10 years. So this area is my passion and the passion of many other yoga teachers that you will be listening to in this series. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get started. Hello, this is episode 18 of Changing the Face of Yoga. It is part one of a four-part series about the future of yoga. I'm welcoming this week Kristine Koverii Weber, who will discuss how yoga will probably look in 5 to 10 years based on the current research, especially in the mental health area. Next week, Linda Baird will discuss ethical considerations for all yoga teachers now and in the future. The third week brings us Tom Myers of Anatomy Train, who again will discuss research, but in the somatics area, and again how that affects us in 5 to 10 years, especially in the regulatory environment. I will do a recap as the fourth podcast. Hello, we have an excellent guest today, and her name is Kristine Koverii Weber. Kristine has a master's degree. She's a certified yoga therapist, an experienced 500-level yoga teacher, and she provides teacher training to other teachers or potential teachers. She's been studying yoga and holistic healing for nearly 30 years and advocating and speaking and teaching about yoga since 1995 and training educators since 2003. Her organization, Subtle Health, provides holistic mind-body trainings, education, and clinical services with the mission of enhancing community health infrastructure. She's the director of Subtle Yoga Teacher Training and presents workshops and trainings internationally and is frequently invited to speak about yoga at healthcare conferences. She has written 2 books, Healing Self-Massage and the Complete Self-Massage Workbook, and she has published several articles in different yoga journals and more public kinds of journals. She's a she's a regular presenter for Yoga U Online and for yogamate.com. She has provided yoga therapy to various populations in institutions and privately since 1996. We're going to talk today about the big picture of yoga, the industrialized world in general, and the U.S. in particular. She believes is facing a massive public health crisis in terms of chronic disease, which I happen to agree with. And she's going to talk about how she thinks yoga can be helpful in this situation. Also about her particular areas of anxiety, depression, trauma, and recovery. Welcome, Kristine. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thank you for having me, Stephanie. It's great to be back.
Anything that you would like to add to that introduction that you'd like people to know?
No, that is just fine.
Okay. Okay, good.
About things.
I'm really kind of interested, really fascinated by this idea of yoga in the context of public health. Mm-hmm. And could you kind of elaborate a bit on that?
Well, first, I would like to differentiate between public health and population health because public health tends to be what is offered through publicly funded organizations, at least in the United States. I know that you aren't in the States, but in the States, that's how we think about public health. So population health is bigger than public health. It includes public health, but it also includes wellness services. And wellness is a $600 billion industry in the United States, and it tends to be primarily conducted through the private sector. But you can also think about places like schools, community centers, workplaces. All of those are involved, can be involved in population health. So population health is bigger. You're looking at swaths of the population, either geographically or in terms of clinical populations. For example, people with diabetes or people with heart disease. Population health is a little bit of a bigger picture view than public health. And it's the reason I focus on it is because it was framed up into a model of health called the Triple Aim, which was created by the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. And the Triple Aim is a model for healthcare improvement that was adopted into the Affordable Care Act. So it is part of the Affordable Care Act in the United States. And the Affordable Care and the Triple Aim says we have three things we need to improve: the patient experience of care. That means people are having better experiences when they're getting care. That makes a lot of sense, right? Then we have to improve costs. So we have to reduce costs. The United States spends 2.5 times as more than any other developing country, and yet their health outcomes look a lot like a developing country. So reducing costs is very important. And then the third aspect was focusing on the health of populations as opposed to simply individuals, because of the tremendous amount of research that has emerged over the past 20 or so years, showing very definitively that health is influenced by where we live, by our access to care, by the people we know. There's something called the social determinants of health, which determine whether or not we're going to have good health outcomes. And they have things to do. It has to do with education levels. It has to do with access to good food. It has to do with access to information. It has to do with who your social networks are. So because we know all these things, it becomes really important to look not just at individuals, but at whole populations. And so the reason I'm interested in this is because let's go back to the Triple Aim: improve patient experience of care, reduce costs, and focus on the health of populations. Well, that sounds a lot like therapeutic yoga to me. Because we can, you think about people enjoying breathing. We could take this to a hospital setting. There's lots of yoga therapists working in hospitals now. We could talk about yoga therapists helping people to breathe better who are in the hospital, helping them to leverage their spiritual assets. Tremendous body of literature out there about how spirituality benefits health, and leverage spiritual assets in a non-sectarian way, right? So that across any belief system. And then helping people to reduce costs, because yoga can be delivered in small group settings. It's not necessarily a one-on-one clinical intervention. It can be delivered in small group settings, which can be very cost effective. Also, if we push back out of the hospital to where that person started their downward trajectory into the hospital, and often these are chronic diseases, we can provide primary and secondary prevention that can help people to not necessarily go down that trajectory, because that's really where yoga shines, is as a primary prevention strategy. So, I think there's many, many reasons. Also, there's the trend of mind-body medicine right now. Mindfulness is really popular, and also looking at trends like mind-body medicine, and also things like integrated care, which is not the same thing as integrative care.
Okay.
Integrative means using things like yoga, acupuncture, massage, homeopathy, those kinds of integrative medicines. But integrated care is a trend right now in the United States. And what is happening there is that there is a movement towards integrating primary care with mental health services. And that's sort of like a new thing in the state. Well, I shouldn't say it's a new thing, but the adoption of it is a new thing in the United States. We have long known that you have much better outcomes if you have mental health strategies available for people in their primary care settings. So with something like integrated care becoming a trend right now, it makes a lot of sense that yoga therapy and mind-body practices would start being integrated on that level as well. When a person comes in who is dealing with depression, for example, and they're coming in to see their primary care provider, rather than just writing a script for SSRIs, the primary care provider can bring in a yoga therapist who can teach the person some mind-body techniques. So not to say that there's never a place for medication, but the overprescription of psychotropic drugs is a huge problem, at least in the United States. I'm sure it is in other countries as well, because it's a simple solution that can be done in a short amount of time, whereas being able to provide some mind-body techniques as brief interventions might be just what somebody needs to get through that more difficult part so that they can start therapy, taking steps that aren't necessarily drug-based. So those are some ideas about population health and yoga.
Like I've said before, I teach seniors, and I find that they do have a lot of chronic illnesses or conditions, really. Things like osteoarthritis or osteoporosis. And there really seems to be little out there for them except drugs. Yoga is good, and many of them who have come to me and have stayed with my classes and stuff feel that that's really very helpful to them. They don't feel like they have very many options.
That's right.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I think that I see that very commonly. They say that, and then you look at the list of medications that they're on, and one medication is to support the side effects of another medication, and it just kind of snowballs. When really if we can help people, roll back the amount of medications that they're on, this is a tremendous service, to their health. The American Medical Association came out with guidelines for the treatment of chronic pain, and the strong suggestion is that people engage in some kind of a training program, some kind of physical activity. They even mentioned yoga specifically. And they said opioid use should be reserved for very few cases, because the evidence shows again and again that opioids are not useful for chronic pain, and in fact, in some cases can make it worse. So, chronic pain is just an example of chronic conditions that people are facing, but because there's so many other ones. But we do know, there's a lot of strong evidence out there in the literature that movement and exercise is useful for many chronic conditions. And you look at the programs of somebody like Dean Ornish, for example. Dean Ornish's work established that heart disease could be reversed. And his work is largely based on yoga theory, lifestyle, and practice. And so when we're starting to see this kind of evidence base, it makes sense to me that the next step is figuring out how to integrate yoga professionals into the healthcare system.
That's a big one. And when you say yoga professionals, are you talking primarily about yoga therapists or yoga teachers also?
I think there's a place for both, so if you're talking about, if you've got somebody who has, let's say, diabetes, and they're on some kind of, maybe they're even on dialysis at this point, but they're really sick. And they maybe on top of that have metabolic syndrome or heart disease or spinal stenosis or obesity on top of it. Like, I don't expect a 200-hour yoga teacher to have a clue what to do with that person. But a well-trained yoga therapist should at least have some place where they know how to start and can interact with other healthcare professionals that person is working with. So, when you're talking about really sick people that are really sick, it makes a lot of sense to employ yoga therapists. But let's go upstream. So this is a metaphor that's often used in public health. They talk about upstream, downstream. Downstream is when somebody is very, very sick and they're in the hospital, and it's very expensive to treat that person. They're often in a lot of pain, and it's just sad. Upstream is you're going to the kids. You're going to people, really upstream is the kids, but even before you get that far upstream, just going upstream a little bit, is looking at people who have risk factors for diabetes, but maybe haven't developed it yet. That kind of intervention makes a lot of sense. Even yoga teachers, I think many yoga teachers have the skills to deal with people who don't yet have chronic pain or spinal stenosis or, full-blown diabetes, but are looking to be a little bit more healthy and a little bit more fit and reduce their stress levels. So yes, there is certainly a place for yoga teachers in the system, but it's more upstream. It's more prevention oriented.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. That I can understand that. I think that because my dealings with yoga therapists is they do tend, I've found, to kind of specialize in an area, so that they are really quite qualified in that area, and they have really good information and up-to-date information. So I can certainly see that difference there. But I am glad that you think there is a role for yoga teachers too. And I'm sure we run into a lot of those kinds of people in our classes where they are at risk, or they may have like pre-diabetes. I had quite a few people in my class who have pre-diabetes, and those kinds of interventions that I can do as a yoga teacher, the students have said are very helpful. So yeah, I'm glad that we both have a role in this, because I think yoga has a lot to offer.
Just the other day, I had somebody in one of my training programs who has diabetes, and she checks her sugar. And she told me before the class, her sugar was 220, and after it was 70. And she said that happens frequently to her. She said it's a frequent. So yoga is not just prevention, it's also treatment. But it's important for us as yoga professionals to differentiate what we do and to decide, okay, I'm going to work more on the prevention side. That's a very noble effort. And it doesn't mean you are less qualified. I think partly what happens because of this sort of incredible crisis of chronic disease that we're dealing with, we start to value the people who work with those chronic disease populations more than we do people who are working on the prevention side. But, people who are doing yoga with children and with pregnant women are doing some of the most profound population health work that is going on out there anywhere. Because as you start to help a pregnant woman reduce her stress, you're going to have a direct effect on the fetus and the stress response system, the development of the stress response system in that child, which is going to have implications 30 and 40 years down the road. So it's so important to value what we do on all levels of the spectrum. And the 4 levels of public health are treatment, prevention, treatment, aftercare, and then prevention and health promotion. So treatment is when somebody has a disease and then they get treated for it, of course. And then aftercare is when they've recovered from their heart disease or whatever. And what kind of things are they doing to recover from it? Health promotion, it should happen through all the rest of the domains. That means promoting healthy lifestyles. And then prevention, of course, is preventing the disease from happening in the first place. So those are the 4 domains that were outlined by the Institute of Medicine.
Well, let's get into some of the specific areas that are of interest to you and where you like to work. Not that you don't like to work in all areas, but we'll talk about anxiety, depression, trauma, and recovery. I believe that that's more the focus of the kinds of training that you're providing. Is that correct?
Yeah, I married a social worker 20 years ago, and so I'm very influenced by mental health. I've also, I also use it because I discovered yoga at a very young age as a way to help me mediate the anxiety in my body as well. It's something that's very close to me. I'm working on a book. I've just submitted a proposal on a book for yoga for anxiety. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed it's going to get accepted by the publisher. And I do think that there's a tremendous scope for helping to mitigate some of the anxiety that people are facing right now as society gets faster and faster and we get more and more deluged with information constantly, there's definitely been an increase in anxiety. So I think yoga just kind of intuitively, we know it's so relaxing, but I think we can be even more specific about how to put the practices together in a way that can really help people. I think it's important to look at people's doshas, specific, if you're working with individuals, look at doshas, look at where look at their health, how their health is, and then make determinations about practices based on evidence and your experience as a provider, and then the needs and the desires of the client. Those things are all really important to me. But I do think with anxiety, I think there's something really, really powerful there. What I've seen is less research actually on anxiety than I've seen on depression. More research on depression, yoga for depression. Of course, the problem is compliance, because a lot of times when people are depressed, they don't feel like moving. So how can we as yoga professionals help people learn how to do smaller things that can get them moving again? And of course, there's research that shows that exercise is as good or even better for many cases of depression, not necessarily serious depressive disorder, but, or major depressive disorder, I'm sorry, but for more, less severe depressions, there's evidence that shows that exercise is as good or better than SSRIs. Knowing how to work with these things, I think, is important. And that's been something that's been really close to my heart for many years. I also am very interested in, I've studied a lot, and I work with a lot of people with trauma histories, especially complex trauma. And complex trauma means developmental trauma. You could say they're slightly different, but similar. Usually people who faced some kind of trauma at the hands of a caregiver, and how that influences their stress system and the way that they respond to stress. And yoga, has been shown. I'm doing a workshop, as I mentioned, I'm doing a workshop for Yoga U in July about yoga for neuroplasticity. That's one thing that I think so exciting is the whole system of yoga, ethical engagement, asanas, meditation, breathing practices is a tremendous system for helping people to engage neuroplasticity and heal from these kinds of childhood traumatic events that have been a shadow over their lives for many years. And then, of course, I'm also interested in addiction recovery, because all of these things are deeply intertwined. Often people have addiction issues that are precipitated by traumatic experiences and or depression and anxiety. And there's lots, it's very out there right now, using yoga in addiction recovery. What I'd like to see more of is people using the whole system of yoga and not just asanas in addiction recovery, because I think there's so much that the tradition offers in terms of taking your attachment away from the behavior or the drug of choice and reattaching to your higher power. And I think yoga is an amazing tool for that. So that's sort of some of a brief rundown of some of the things that I've been working on for a few
years. I can see why you're immensely busy. I'm very impressed.
That's why I have to do a lot of yoga, Stephanie.
Yes, we do need that. The more we get busy, don't we? Are you seeing in the United States, and I'm not saying that I exactly know what's happening in Australia in this area, but are you seeing in the United States a much more open, that people are much more open to looking at yoga for these different types of mental issues, anxiety, depression, trauma, and recovery? I mean, is the medical system getting more online with that, or?
I would say absolutely. I would say there's absolutely a shift it's a very exciting time right now. As much as we've had so much regression on our, on the national scene in terms of like a populist movement or a conservative movement in this country, the other piece is that hasn't stopped so much of the progressive healthcare movement that's happening, because you always have, I remember listening to my Indian teachers, and they would say, you always have polarities. You always have polarities. So you think something is really bad, but often something really amazing is emerging as a result of that. And that's kind of, if I take that wider view of what's going on in this culture, I would say that there's a tremendous force for progress in the health sphere. And many, many people working on really exciting, so much exciting research happening, and many people working on exciting new innovative health programs as well. So I think there's a huge movement of mind-body medicine right now, a huge scope for it. I think sometimes the word yoga, unfortunately, gets pigeonholed into the fitness industry. And so sometimes, like I did a webinar a few weeks ago, and my bio was, I'm a mind-body expert. And I'm happy to use that as opposed to I'm a yoga therapist, even though it's kind of sad. But at the same time, like sometimes I have to use that kind of language to differentiate what I'm doing from fitness yoga, And there's nothing wrong with fitness yoga, by the way. It's just that it's limiting, and it's in its perception. It gets limited in the way that people perceive it. So at any rate, I think there's numerous trends and factors out there pointing directly to this need for deep need for mind-body approaches. And yoga is a complete system. Mindfulness is great, but it's not a complete system. Yoga is a complete system that really addresses all aspects of human existence. And I think that's what's so exciting.
Yes, it is. I agree. I think too, I understand why you're saying that you're a mind-body professional, because I do think, and this is one of the reasons for this podcast, is that there is a public perception that's extremely narrow about yoga. And it is, in many cases, the fitness yoga, if we can use that terminology. And so I'm really I really applaud you for trying to think out of the box about how we can introduce to everybody the really incredible nature of yoga, and how it is, as you said, a complete system, and that it can be used for a variety of things. Thank you so much.
I would like to say one more thing about that I think might be helpful for your listeners if they're yoga professionals, because I just have to tell a little bit about my story, which was I moved to Asheville, North Carolina in 2001. And at that time, and I had been teaching yoga for 5 or 6 years by then. And at that time, what was really happening here was this sort of power flow yoga stuff. And it just got more and more popular. And, so here I am teaching my little yoga practices, that I learned from my teachers in India. And, and I've been studying with Vinny yoga at that point already. And people weren't showing up for my classes, and I thought, well, that's really weird. Why aren't people coming? And I looked at the other, yoga teachers in my town, and they were really popular, and they had all these, and these people would come to their classes 3 times a week, and, they're filling up their coffers. And I felt like there was something really deficient, or maybe I wasn't a good yoga teacher. I didn't know. I didn't have a convincing argument for why what I did was good, because I couldn't say you'll come and you'll get hot and sweaty. So, and that's what people wanted, and it took me a while to really figure it out. And I was like, oh, they're going to those classes. Like they would tell me, they'd be like, oh, well, I love your class because it's really relaxing. But then they would only come like once a month or something, Mm-hmm. So it took me a while, and I figured it out, and I was like, oh, they go to those classes because they're exercising, and everybody knows that you have to exercise 3 times a week. That's what you have to do. I mean, that has been so deeply ingrained in our consciousness since the late 60s. This guy named Kenneth Cooper came out with a book called The Aerobics Revolution. Everybody started to know, okay, this is what you have to do for your health. Well, the thing that is just starting to emerge, and I think there's been some very big studies like from the Henry Benson Institute that have come out over the past year or so that are saying, guess what? There's this other part of your nervous system that also has to train. And it has to do with the parasympathetic part of the nervous system. It has to do with vagal tone. It has to do with respiratory musculature. It has to do with different parts of the brain and the stress response system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This kind of training you don't get by going to a spinning class or a hot yoga class. You get it by practicing to be quiet and still and taking yourself in that direction and dealing with the impatience and the boredom and all of that stuff. Through that, you start to develop more resiliency in the nervous system. So I talk about the difference between fitness yoga and resiliency-based yoga. And the next big thing is going to be, and it already is, but it's going to explode, is going to be training the nervous system for resiliency. And you can't get all of that from fitness-based, but you can get it from mindful, slow mind-body practices. And that's where, that's what I have tried to develop with subtle yoga. And I think a lot of people out there who are teaching these kinds of practices are going to be really pleasantly surprised in 5 or 10 years to see the tremendous growth in their businesses.
Excellent. I'm waiting. To add my story, I teach seniors, and I've started teaching them really specifically in class how to meditate. And right. I wasn't sure how well it would go over because there is some issue with some people about, is yoga a religion, and can I still, is it going to replace my religion if I do it? And so, it's a little bit of a narrow path to walk, but I am surprised at how much they like it and how much they come back and say, now, what was I supposed to do here? What was I? And I'm going, wow, I'm really very surprised and very hopeful that this will be good, because they often do need, because of the chronic issues they often have, they really do need that resiliency to get through a day sometimes. Yeah.
Oh, that's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. That's really yeah, it's so inspiring. Like, there's so much really good stuff happening out there,
There is.
Sometimes we can just feel swamped in the media portrayal of yoga, but there's really, really exciting and deep stuff happening out there. And if people get their foot in the door with fitnessy stuff, okay, that's fine. I'm fine with that.
Yeah. It starts them on the journey. I'm sure that all of you are really interested in what Kristine said. If you'd like to know a bit more, you can go to her website, which is www.subtleyoga.com. And she has a newsletter sign up that you can sign up and see what else she's doing these days, which is a tremendous amount. I'm very impressed with everything she's doing. Just to explore a little more about what she's offering in her trainings and what she's thinking these days, which is pretty exciting, really. So I want to thank you, Kristine, for coming on. And if there's any last remarks you'd like to make, please do.
Well, I think the only thing I wanted to add was that I have a program coming up with Yoga U, although I think I mentioned it, and that information is on my website. So for your listeners who are down under and maybe don't get to North Carolina so often, I have a program on neuroplasticity coming up with them, but I have several other online recorded programs with them if you want to, more information about subtle yoga or to study one of these topics a little more in depth with me.
Okay. It sounds wonderful. I think I'm going to go and look it up. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Kristine. You've been just a great guest.
It's been great to be with you. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for that wonderful interview. If you would like to be a guest on Changing the Face of Yoga, please go to my website, www.yogalightness.com.au, and under the Changing the Face of Yoga tab, you can complete Be Our Guest form. After reviewing the form and finding it applicable to this podcast, we will send you a link to schedule an interview. Please download, review, and tell your friends of any podcasts that are of interest to you and to them. If you would like to contact me, send an email to info@yogalightness.com.au. And thank you for listening to Changing the Face of Yoga.